For 4 years, the Chinese held it in reserve. They absorbed all American pressure. They filed objections. But the fact that these 5 teapot refineries in this particular moment, in the middle of an active war in the Middle East, was the trigger, that's not incidental. It's a decision by the Chinese. Now, this blocking order is China suddenly deciding to challenge American power at what it deems to be now the right time.
马上川普就要来华访问了，就在这个节骨眼上，为什么中国商务部突然拿出了一部准备了整整4年却从未使用过的法律工具，在历史上第一次亮剑？这是在给川普下马威吗？两边到底在打什么牌呢？大家好，欢迎来到本期视频。先来介绍一下背景啊，本期视频的主人公是纳吉玛·明哈斯，他是一位非常资深的地缘政经分析师，拥有哥伦比亚大学国际关系硕士和伦敦政治经济学院经济硕士双学位。在进入媒体行业之前，他曾在纽约的雷曼兄弟和伦敦的渣打银行担任外汇交易员，这两个地方就是全球金融体系的心脏地带，所以说他对金融市场的底层脉动可以说是了如指掌。之后他又在世界银行和美国国际开发署担任顾问，再后来他创办了自己的自媒体频道，叫 GBS 深度探险。他自己的风格也非常鲜明，不搞标题党，不聊新闻流水账，专门带你钻进棋盘下面，看清世界上那些表象之下涌动的暗流。他擅长把宏大的地缘博弈压缩进一个个具体的困境里面，然后用冷峻克制的逻辑让你自己得出结论。好，话不说，我们来看正片吧。
Less than 10 days after Washington escalated its pressure campaign against Iran's oil network, a development emerged that involves no missiles and no warships, but it may prove to be more consequential than either of those things in determining how economic power will actually function in the decades ahead. China's Ministry of Commerce pulled out a legal instrument it had never once used since they wrote it in 2021. They've now activated it for the first time in history. What came out was a prohibition order. The US sanctions, which were imposed on 5 Chinese oil refineries under the US Executive Orders 13902 and 13846, would carry no legal standing on Chinese soil. The Commerce Ministry used a triple negative in their original Chinese statement: shall not be recognized, shall not be enforced, shall not be complied with. The ministry declared that the Chinese government has consistently opposed unilateral sanctions that lack authorization from the United Nations and a basis in international law. Now, this Chinese blocking law, which is titled Measures to Prevent the Improper Extraterritorial Application of Foreign Laws and Measures, along with some further regulations most recently just issued in April this year under the State Council Decree number 835, creating a malicious entity list for anyone enforcing US sanctions. Now, these regulations combined explicitly place American sanctions authority outside the boundaries of Chinese jurisdiction and orders every Chinese firm and individual in the country to treat those sanctions as if they do not exist. So, if you do comply with those US extraterritorial sanctions and you cut off a Chinese company, you will now be violating a Chinese law. And that applies whether you're a Chinese or a foreign company. You can be fined by the MOFCOM, sued in Chinese courts, and placed on that malicious entity list, which means that your assets can be frozen and trade restrictions can be imposed on you. Now, the regulations were written specifically to counter American sanctions overreach that was happening past several years. For 4 years, the Chinese held it in reserve. They absorbed all American pressure. They filed objections. They issued statements against American actions. But the fact that these 5 teapot refineries in this particular moment, in the middle of an active war in the Middle East, was the trigger, that's not incidental. It's a decision by the Chinese. And understanding what that decision means requires that we go back to something that most coverage of this story has entirely missed. For years, China was actually playing along until now. And here's something that tends to get lost in the narrative about Chinese defying the American sanctions. By and large, Chinese companies and financial institutions have largely complied with these extraterritorial US sanctions in the past voluntarily, inside their own borders, where they have no legal obligation to do so. Now, the anecdotal illustration of this is quite striking. There are many documented cases of Chinese banks operating inside mainland China that refused to serve companies or individuals that were sanctioned by the United States. People that China itself may have no diplomatic problem with, simply because those individuals or companies appear on an American list somewhere. And it's not just banks. Even WePay, they won't let you set up an account either. Now, that's the depth of goodwill that China had been extending to the United States on sanctions compliance, and it extended it for years without being asked to formalize it and without receiving much acknowledgement that it was doing so in return. Now, this blocking order is China suddenly deciding to challenge American power at what it deems to be now the right time. And the question of what caused that leads directly to Washington's immediate decision-making over the past several weeks, but also its own declining legitimacy in the last almost 18 months during the Trump administration. What triggered this is not new Iran sanctions regime. It was a dramatic escalation in the enforcement of the existing ones. In late April, under what the US administration has branded Operation Economic Fury, it's a name that they're not being very subtle about the intentions, the Treasury Department took two specific actions that appear to have crossed what the Beijing has called a red line for itself. But it never stated that red line publicly. The first was an alert issued to financial institutions worldwide, including those operating in China, explicitly warning them about the sanctions risk associated with independent teapot oil refineries in Shandong province for their continued role in importing and refining Iranian crude. Now, this wasn't a designation, it was a warning to the entire global banking and insurance infrastructure that anyone that serves these refineries does so at its own risk of being cut off from the dollar system. And we're not talking about small amounts. The Chinese private sector, these so-called teapot refineries, account for as much as 1/3 of refining capacity. So for China, an extension of such an action by the US matters a lot. The second US action was actually much more specific and much more consequential. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctioned Hengli Petrochemical in Dalian by name. It's one of China's largest private refineries. It operates almost 400,000 barrels per day. And it has a parent company that sits in the Fortune Global 500. Now, the Treasury, the US Treasury, described Hengli as one of Tehran's most valued customers and estimated its purchases had channeled hundreds of millions of dollars back towards Iranian state institutions. Alongside Hengli, 4 additional teapot refineries in Shandong and Hebei were designated. Shandong Zhisheng Petrochemical Group, the Hubei Xinji Chemical Group, the Shouguang Luxing Petrochemical, and Shandong Chongqing Chemical. What these designations mean in practice is total exclusion from the dollar-based financial system, not just for the refineries themselves, but for any bank, insurer, or trading partner anywhere in the world that continues doing business with them. And the intent was to create a ring of financial isolation around these companies that would eventually make their operations unsustainable, regardless of what Beijing wanted. Now, China's calculation evidently was that sanctioning a Fortune 500 linked Chinese company by name through executive orders targeting a third country without UN authorization, while simultaneously pressurizing Chinese financial institutions inside China, was basically the red line here. Not the sanctions in principle, but rather this particular combination of scale, targeting, and extraterritorial reach. The formal name of what China just invoked is the Regulations on Countering Unjustified Extraterritorial Application of Foreign Legislation and Other Measures. That's what the blocking statutes known as, and it was enacted on January the 9th in 2021. And in April 2026, it was extended with an addendum that made its reach explicitly extraterritorial as well. The blocking statute emerged during a period of heightened stress that existed between China and the Western nations. It was Beijing's accumulated response to roughly 3 years before that of escalating American economic warfare. Huawei was blacklisted in the United States, and the US pressurized other countries, the UK and Europe, to do the same. It imposed chip export controls, and there was simmering tension over Meng Wanzhou's detention in Canada. And there was coordinated Western sanctions over the Xinjiang and Hong Kong at the time. All of these hit China simultaneously. So this law in 2021 was the answer to that. The fact that it sat unused for 4 more years and was finally pulled out specifically for these 5 oil refineries is what makes that current moment so significant. The law itself is written very broad. It's broad enough to apply to any country. But it was designed almost entirely with the United States in mind, as a response to those American sanctions and the way they're practiced. The secondary sanctions mechanism in particular, the tool that Washington uses to punish foreign companies in third countries for doing business with targets it's designated, regardless of whether those companies have any connection to the United States. The law has 6 key provisions and each of them matters. First, it's grounded in China's national security law, meaning it's not just a trade dispute or a commercial regulation. It's invoking the National Security Act. Secondly, Chinese firms and individuals are now required to report any foreign sanctions that they receive directly to MOFCOM, giving Beijing real-time visibility in exactly how American pressure is landing on Chinese companies. Third, the ministry has the authority, which it has now exercised, to issue injunctions prohibiting Chinese entities from recognizing or even complying with those sanctions. Fourth, any Chinese company that suffers losses because another party chooses to comply with foreign sanctions can now sue that party for damages in Chinese courts. Then Beijing has reserved the right to provide direct financial support to Chinese firms that incur losses from following Chinese injunctions rather than American ones. They're going to help you out if the Americans punish you. And sixth, China has explicitly retained the authority to take what the statute calls necessary countermeasures. Now, the language there has been deliberately left undefined and left open. In a sentence, Washington is saying, cut them off or we cut you off. Beijing is now saying, if you cut them off, we will come after you too, in Chinese courts and on Chinese lists and potentially beyond that. So what this creates for the institutions caught in the middle, the global banks, the shipping companies, the insurers and trading houses that physically make all that international oil trade possible, it's not an easy decision. Either you comply with US sanctions on these refineries and you risk being blacklisted, fined, sued, or placed on China's malicious entity list, losing access to one of the world's largest markets. So you defy those sanctions to stay in Beijing's good graces, and then you face American secondary sanctions that can sever your access to the dollar system, cut off the financial infrastructure that underpins almost every major international transaction. So there's no clean path through this for those companies caught. The compliance trap isn't just the side effect of this blocking order. Beijing is basically forcing that intermediary layer of global trade, the banks, the shippers, the insurers, that they need to make a choice about which legal system they ultimately answer to. And given that the overwhelming majority of these companies caught in this bind are operating primarily inside China, the direction most of them will choose is not difficult to predict. But it also means that increasingly Western organizations and multinationals, whose risk departments will clearly see 2 paths emerging, will decide we need to get out of China. And they're making that decoupling that everyone's been talking about for over a decade now start to take place in an accelerated mode. Now, to understand why these 5 companies were worth this level of confrontation, it's necessary to understand what China's independent refinery sector actually does in the global oil market. These independent refineries have built their business model in part because of the willingness to source crude from markets that others are not going to touch. Iran, Russia, Venezuela. And obviously they're getting a discount as a result of that. China is alone absorbing a volume that effectively offsets any intended economic impact that the Americans have been doing for years, trying to force Iran under sanctions. Without the Chinese demand, though, the sanctions architecture against Iran functions very differently. With it, Tehran retains a financial lifeline, and no amount of secondary pressure has managed to permanently sever that. Now, Washington's decision to target the buyers directly, to go after those Chinese companies rather than what they used to do before, which was to pressurize the intermediaries and the shadow shipping networks, is a recognition that the indirect approach had basically reached the ceiling of its impact. The implementation of the blocking order in response is Beijing's recognition that Washington's made a fundamental choice about how far it was willing to push, and that a fundamental response was required from it. Now, China's blocking order provides that system with its legal foundation. What previously operated as a pragmatic workaround will now start to get an explicit state backing, and that changes that risk calculus for every intermediary, shipper, and financial institution operating within China's sphere of influence. And the escalation dynamic from here is not complicated to describe, but it's genuinely difficult to navigate. If the United States decides to enforce the logic of its sanctions, if it moves to designate Chinese banks who serve those refineries or financial institutions that continue servicing Hengli and the other targeted refineries, it's going to cross into territory that's got nothing to do with Iranian oil anymore. The moment a major Chinese bank is sanctioned for dealing with, for example, Hengli, this stops being a pressure campaign against Tehran, and it becomes a direct financial confrontation between the two largest economies on earth, with the consequences for the global financial system, which are difficult to model, impossible to fully contain. Alternatively, if Washington backs off, if it issues those sanctions and then watches China activate the blocking statute and decides not to further escalate, then Beijing will have demonstrated something with significant long-term implications. That American extraterritorial sanctions applied against Chinese entities inside China are largely a bluff, and that sufficient resolve can call them out. Neither outcome is comfortable for Washington. One leads to financial confrontation that it's not going to be ready to manage right now. The other erodes its credibility of the sanctions architecture that has been one of its primary instruments for global leverage now for decades. Whether it was Cuba, whether it was Russia, whether it's Iran, and now on Chinese entities. With the US-China summit coming up in the next week, US backing off is what's expected, given the fact that the US-China summit is coming up in the next week. It's the outcome that Trump is already most known for being taco when it comes to hard decisions. The broader damage from a Western perspective may already have been done, regardless of how these refineries issues actually resolves. China used to extend remarkable goodwill on sanctions compliance. It was voluntarily cooperating with extraterritorial restrictions inside its own boundaries, even though it was not legally obliged to do so, but it did so. That goodwill has now been formally withdrawn, and a China with less deference towards American financial hegemony is a fundamentally different operating environment for US foreign policy, for US economic policy.
好，视频看完了，我们来聊点有意思的。第一，为什么偏偏选择这个时间点？这是在给川普下马威吗？首先得说一个基础常识啊，在国际政治里，两国领导人能坐到同一张桌子上，从来不是临时起意。峰会日期一旦敲定，说明双方的高级幕僚已经在幕后接触了至少数月，把能谈妥的基础成果全部提前锁定了。峰会本身主要是让领导人最终拍板握手定调，没有足够的前期成果托底，元首会晤根本不可能安排。在这个前提下，美方在峰会筹备期间采取如此高烈度的单边制裁行为，这个时间点本身就很微妙，本质上又是想在对华博弈中增加筹码，占据优势，属于惯用伎俩了。这次中国随机发布的阻断令，从决策逻辑上看，更像是一场有准备的高层战略级别的反击。它向华盛顿传达了一个清晰无比的信号：你的制裁以及以后所有的制裁，在我这里都不算数。跟美国那些暗戳戳的背后捅刀子的玩法不同，这是阳谋。在你进门之前，我先把规则拍在桌子上。你不是想带着制裁大棒来施压吗？不好意思，我不仅把你大棒给卸了，还反手给了你一巴掌。想怎么样？你想跟我火拼吗？这里插个题外话，我觉得中国高层的政治博弈真是越来越老辣。 不是不出手，一旦出手就打在你的七寸上，而且每次不仅在实力上站得住脚，还把道义也涨到了最高点，让你挑不出任何毛病，你不接受也得接受，根本不给你回旋的余地，这就叫无解。第二，人民币国际化拿到了司法尚方宝剑。过去很多国家和企业想用人民币结算，但犹豫不决，核心原因是怕美国2级制裁。现在阻断法意味着人民币跨境支付系统从此有了一道法律防火墙，你可以直接在中国国内银行开户，用人民币收付伊朗和俄罗斯的石油，或者进行任何其他的合法贸易活动，完全站得住脚。所以这不是简单的阻断，这一方面是在给石油人民币国际化铺高速公路，另一方面是在美国金融体系的大池子里直接切出来了一个独立的人民币金融池。而这就引出了第3点，全球商业法律体系正在裂变，平行宇宙正式降临。以前的全球化只有一个池子，就是美元霸权的池子，任何在这个池子里的人都要遵守一条规则，美元就是法，美元的制裁就是天条，没得商量。但现在中国基于自身实力另辟了一个人民币的新池子，并且在里面宣布，在这个地盘上我的法最大。那么问题就来了，以后马士基的货轮进了上海港，他到底听谁的呢？汇丰银行的法务部同时面对美国制裁令和中国阻断令2套完全冲突的判决，他该怎么办呢？没有任何一条路能同时满足两边，所以最后极有可能的结果是跨国公司主动法律辖区切割，切分成美元合规部和人民币合规部，然后各自独立运营。所以我们正亲眼看见全球金融贸易的架构被硬生生拆成2半，两个平行的治理体系开始成型。这不仅仅是对美元体系的沉重打击，更深远的意义在于，以前那些因为害怕美国制裁而不敢动弹的国家和企业，现在有了一条全新的通道，他们可以绕过美元体系，在中国的金融池子里进行贸易和投资，而这些活动美国根本查不到，也管不着。说白了，这也相当于中国自立山头，然后对着全世界宣布，以后我地盘上的兄弟我罩着，美国你动一下试试。好了，本期视频就到这里了，本频道仅代表个人观点，欢迎大家在评论区理性交流和补充。另外，制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，感谢您动动手指，一键3连。如果您有更多想法或建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，我都会看见。我们下期见。